For many years, Russian propaganda has portrayed Europe as weak, cowardly, and helpless. Europeans were constantly said to be decaying, freezing, and dancing to America's tune.
This week, two major tourist meccas, Paris and Venice, have turned into places you'd be better off not visiting.
There are protests in Paris and flooding in Venice. There's nothing for Russians to do there.
In the UK, in the resort town of Eastbourne on the English Channel, they are preparing to declare a state of emergency due to rising poverty and possible hunger.
In Germany, they've run out of sunflower oil. In Italy, it's being sold 2 bottles per person.
They're suggesting people save on toilet paper, which has already gone up in price by 33%. The British media recalled a reusable alternative. You buy a roll and wash it a couple of times a week.
That's exactly why the Kremlin attacked Ukraine, because they believed that Europeans wouldn't be able to do anything. In principle, after the nauseating and toothless concern over the annexation of Crimea and Donbass, Putin had reason to think that way. So in 2022, he had no doubt that he would capture Ukraine in 3 days. And on the 4th, he would be trading with Europe, as if nothing had happened.
Whoever tries to interfere with us, and especially those who create threats to our country, to our people, must know that Russia's response will be immediate and will lead you to consequences you have never faced in your history.
Propaganda even allowed itself to openly fantasize about attacking Europe itself after Ukraine. Well, why not? In the minds of these crazed conquerors, their so-called second strongest army in the world could easily reach Lisbon.
The Suwalki Corridor. There it is.
There it is, beautiful, yes.
The Russian Army Group. In Kaliningrad and the Belarusian Armed Forces block the Suwalki Corridor, link up, and isolate NATO and Poland from the Baltic states.
But the Ukrainian people gave the orcs a harsh reality check. And most importantly, he woke up the Europeans. With each new day, with every month of resistance, Europeans started to peek out more and more from under the shell of comfortable indifference. And even if slowly, the aid started to come. Macron, who used to love calling Putin, has actually become the main European hawk. Today, France is already supplying Ukraine with combat aircraft.
The first French Mirage 2000 fighter jets have been delivered to Ukraine. This was announced by the French Minister of the Armed Forces, Sébastien Lecornu.
And just recently, the President of France initiated an emergency meeting of European leaders in response to the strange and eccentric behavior of the Americans. Europeans were shocked by Trump's call to Putin, during which the two old men had a pleasant chat and decided to make peace behind the backs of Europe and Ukraine. Countries are being used.
Forcing Ukraine to cede its territory to Russia would, without question, indeed truly be the greatest betrayal since 1945.
Before that, Putin wrote an article in which he called Trump the master of Europe, at whose feet all Europeans would soon come running, wagging their tails. No one cares what that pale terrorist writes under his Botox drip. What amazed everyone was that Trump reposted Putin's words. In other words, the President of the United States agrees with the statement that Europe is a little dog at the feet of great leaders.
Oh my God, no.
But the new American administration didn't stop there, and decided to test the nerves of their still allied Europeans once again. At the Munich Security Conference, Vice President Vance arrived and delivered his now famous speech in which he accused Europe of lacking democracy and called on Europeans to vote for ultra-right fascist parties.
This is some kind of disgrace.
And most importantly, Vance didn't say a single bad word about Russia or Putin. After all, everyone knows that there's no democracy in Europe, while the swamps are a liberal paradise.
Vance's speech shocked many at the Munich conference. There were expectations that the representative of the American administration would clarify the negotiations with Russia and Ukraine in his speech. But in this keynote speech, the main threat was declared to be the European Union itself.
The threat that worries me the most when it comes to Europe is not Russia, not China, and not any other external actor. What especially concerns me is the internal threat of Europe slowly retreating from some of its most fundamental and cherished values.
The démarche by the U.S. Vice President, his demonstrative disregard for allies and partners, had an explosive effect. the Europeans responded sharply and firmly.
Therefore, I simply cannot ignore what we have just heard here today. I truly cannot help but make a brief and important comment on the speech delivered by the American Vice President. We are indeed fighting for your right to be against us. This is in fact one of the guiding mottos of the Bundeswehr, and it stands as a powerful and enduring symbol for our democracy. This democracy was just recently called into question by the American Vice President, and not only German democracy, but in particular indeed the entirety of Europe as well. He spoke about the annulment of democracy. And if I understood him correctly, he is comparing the state of Europe to the situation prevailing in some authoritarian regimes. Ladies and gentlemen, this is simply unacceptable.
Finally, what should have happened back in 2014 has happened. Old Europe has awakened and drawn its knives. The Trumpists were certain that the Europeans would do whatever they were told from Washington. Perhaps that's how it would have turned out, but for some reason the Americans started to humiliate and insult the old world. And that is a colossal mistake.
Oh, what a fool!
Everyone has forgotten who the Europeans really are. They are the most warlike and aggressive peoples in the history of humanity. The French, Germans, British, Italians, and Spaniards once conquered the entire world, and they turned world wars into an assembly line. The fact that they have lived peacefully for 80 years should have been seen as a gift from God, not as a weakness, or a reason to prod them with a stick.
Run, you fools.
German Chancellor Scholz is urging Parliament to declare a state of emergency in the country because of the actions of the American administration, and to prepare for war. For some reason, no one's heart skipped a beat at the news, Germany is preparing for war. Just this phrase alone should send a chilling terror through all of humanity.
Look at these photos, Ms. Weidel, and look at the people in Ukraine. You said a very telling phrase here, something like, Russia no longer considers us neutral. No, Ms. Weidel. We are not neutral. We are not standing aside. We are on Ukraine's side, defending our political system together with them.
The President of France is urgently gathering European leaders to discuss joint security in the face of the aggressive policies of the United States. Trump helped Putin accomplish what he hadn't been able to do for 10 years, awaken the monster.
What we are supplying is not enough to repel Russian aggression. That's why I agree with my European colleagues. We need to strike targets on Russian territory. I hope that in this decisive moment we are experiencing, we will be able to reach 100% agreement on everything we are doing in the field of defense.
Europe and Ukraine are now closer than ever. Before our eyes, a new defense alliance is taking shape, one that will replace the ineffective NATO. If the US no longer wants to defend Europe, Europe will defend itself. The President of Ukraine proposed creating a united European army at Munich. Ukrainian troops will become its backbone, and after defeating the orcs, will be able to replace the American contingent.
Without the Ukrainian army, European armies will not be sufficient to stop Russia. Only our army in Europe has modern combat experience. But our army alone is also not enough. We need what you can provide: weapons, training, sanctions, funding, firm political pressure, and unity.
Within the EU itself, people are now openly discussing the previously unthinkable, sending their own soldiers to Ukraine to maintain peace and guarantee security. Not long ago, this seemed like science fiction, but now it is reality. France is taking the lead here. Macron was already prepared to send French soldiers to Ukraine last year. And today the issue is even more pressing. Europeans are considering sending 25,000, although Ukraine is insisting on 110,000. But what's important here is that the discussion is not about whether to send troops, but about how many to send.
You get it, right?
Europe is bristling and shifting onto a war footing. Why is it happening so slowly? Because the Western world had its own system that developed over decades. Europe focused on developing civilian industries and consumer goods, while the US acted as the bodyguard. An enormous number of military enterprises are concentrated specifically in America. Now, everything will change.
Absolutely, 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 absolutely.
The Europeans have stood together with Ukraine as a united front, After Trump and Putin tried to make a backroom phone deal, the leaders of Europe's major countries issued a joint condemnation of such actions. In addition, the Europeans called the rare earth metals deal that Trump tried to push on Ukraine an act of looting.
Trump emphasized that Ukraine should compensate the United States for nearly $300 billion provided in support. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz sharply criticized this idea, stating that Ukraine itself would need resources to recover after the war. He emphasized that using these funds now to cover military expenses would be selfish and self-centered. According to him, the country needs a strong army and long-term funding.
The agreement to transfer 50% of all Ukrainian resources to the United States was handed to the Ukrainian side 4 hours before the negotiations. Not to mention the fact that it was drafted by the screenwriter of the film Dumb and Dumber. The main thing is that this agreement did not contain any security guarantees. In short, you give us the resources and let Europe provide the security guarantees. Naturally, no one was willing to sign such a document.
But when we got down to the details, there still weren't any security guarantees. If Ukraine opens everything up to the US, and they invest and want to count on something in return, then the specific request from the US should clearly state what security guarantees they are providing to Ukraine. Am I not getting to the point yet? The issue isn't just about taking the resource. In other words, the point is that if you invest, there should be something attached to that resource. We are not a raw materials country. And I think this point, that we are not a raw materials country, should be clearly reflected in the document.
It seems that in its actions, the new American administration is relying on the Russian avos. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. They should have spent less time talking to Putin. Perhaps the thing is contagious. Moscow decided to seize the largest country in Europe on a whim. They also thought that Ukraine was weak and defenseless. Everyone knows how that turned out.
And soon it will be half a year since those very scatterbrains, yes, the scatterbrains are in the Kursk region, and the fight for every settlement there is anything but child's play.
Right now, the question is being raised about creating a military coalition between the EU, Britain, and Ukraine. An economic giant with a population of 500 million, MENA combined with the Ukrainian army, one of the most capable in the world, and European resources together with Ukrainian military personnel will resolve the security issue on the old continent once and for all.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.